afternoon, everyone. It's great to see such a big crowd. We're adding in chairs. There's so many people here, so this is great. Even my youngest grandson is here today, so this is great. So I'm John Bitson. I'm the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Menard Family Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm super excited today, and I'm honored that we have Bob Zoellick here today, former President of the World Bank, U.S. Trade Representative, and Deputy Secretary of State. He's one of the most knowledgeable people in the world in understanding the global economy, international trade, international relations, foreign policy, U.S. diplomacy. And so I know people are very concerned about all the things that are happening in the world with the tariffs, and I know he's going to be able to answer a lot of questions that people have. So please, with this great audience here, get your questions ready. You'll get a chance to ask your own questions after I ask a few questions of Bob after his presentation. I'm grateful to the Menard family and to all of our donors for making this possible. I'm grateful for Bob for making the trip here. The former president of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012, trade representative from 2001 to 2005, and deputy secretary of state from 2005 to 2006. Robert Zoellick is one of the world's most distinguished authorities on the global economy, international finance, and foreign policy. He is unrivaled in his depth and breadth of what makes global economies tick and how best to operate in an increasingly global market. Zoellick is recipient of the Distinguished Service Award, the Department of State's highest honor, and he continues his work as a top expert in finance and economics as a non-executive chairman of AllianceBernstein, a leading global investment management firm that offers high-quality research and diversified investment services to institutional investors, individuals, and private wealth clients in major world markets. So again, grateful to our donors for making this possible, grateful to everyone for being here, grateful to Bob for making the trip, and to his wife Sherry for making the trip as well. Let's all give a warm welcome to Bob Zoellick.
Thank you, John. So I want to thank Professor Bitson for inviting me, and for the Menard Family Foundation and the Challey Institute for hosting us today. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you, especially the students who I had some chance to meet in Professor Bitson's class early this morning. My wife and I came a couple days early. We flew into Bismarck, and we wanted to drive out to see the Theodore Roosevelt Center of National Park. And I have a short story to share with you along the way. We live in McLean, Virginia, which is about a mile away from Langley. That's where the CIA is located. And so I'm pretty familiar with the intelligence community. But this incident really was kind of worth noting. So we drove along some of the back roads because we actually wanted to get to see sort of Roosevelt's, the site of his ranch. And as we're driving along, I saw this sign that said, "Talking dog for sale, $25. And I thought, well, this is pretty odd. But, you know, when you see something like that, you can't pass it up. So I said to Sherry, look, I'm going to stop. And so we stopped. I knocked on the door, and I said, I saw your sign. And the guy says, yeah, he's in the back. Go ahead and see him. So, but now I'm feeling a little strange, but I go back, and there's this sort of older black Labrador. You know how they get a little gray around the muzzle? And I'm feeling pretty sort of stupid, but I sort of say, are you the talking dog? And he says, well, yes, I am. And now I'm really shocked. And I say, how did this happen? He said, yeah, I don't know. He said, when I was a pup, I would just hang around people, and I realized pretty soon that I could understand what they were saying, and pretty soon I could start to talk. He said, but that isn't the half of it. He said, you know, once the intelligence agencies learned that I could listen and talk, he said, you know, FBI, CIA, NSA, they all brought me in. He said, you know, and things that I saw around the world, because nobody expects the dog at the table to be able to come back and tell stories, right? He says, it's incredible. So by now, I'm really stunned. So I walk back to the front door, and I say, you know, I spoke to your dog. I said, that's incredible. I said, you're selling him for $25? And the guy turns to me and says, oh, that old liar, he's never been out of the backyard. So, so I'm going to share some other stories with you, a little bit different nature today. In particular, 3 that try to show a little bit about how history offers some insights about economics and foreign policy today. So the first one involves Alexander Hamilton, who you might know from the musical, or for those of you that still carry cash, he's on the $10 bill. In 1781, Colonel Hamilton resigned his post as George Washington's principal staff assistant. And he wanted to contemplate the nature of the 6-year war that you new Americans had been fighting against Great Britain. And so he retreated to his his father-in-law's library. And he started to read and study about sort of the nature of the conflict. And this was a lull in 1781 before the key Yorktown campaign. And he came to a critical recognition, which was that he recognized that the war for independence had fundamentally become a war of attrition. London had enjoyed staying power to maintain armies and fleets, even hire mercenaries, supply them across the Atlantic, because of Britain's financial system enabled huge borrowings. So Hamilton could see that Britain's powerful financial credit was a weapon of war. The new U.S., in contrast, depended on French loans, French army, French fleet. The small Continental Army was basically hanging on through a thread, through Valley Forge in the years afterwards. And as Hamilton sort of recalled, he said, "Power without revenue is a bubble." Now, a little later that year, the French and the Americans together cornered the British at Yorktown in 1781 in October, and then the peace treaty was signed in 1783. But 8 years after Yorktown, Hamilton becomes the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. And he resolved to build a system of economic and financial power. But the United States was broke. It couldn't borrow. Its securities existing were worth sort of cents on the dollar. And so Hamilton devised what is still today a stunning plan of interlocking parts to establish the financial credit of the new United States. One part of it was he assumed all the federal and state debts, including the key states, to bring them part of it, and he restructured them into a series of new bonds. He was able to use revenue from the trade for the new customs authority to pay the interest on the bonds. He created a Coast Guard because somebody had to check whether ships were indeed coming in or smuggling. It was really the first information system in the United States in all the ports. He created a new Bank of the United States to handle the payments and to begin to use the U.S. securities as a form of financial credit. He even set up a special sinking fund to try to reassure creditors that America would pay its debts. And importantly, recognizing the importance of market psychology, he did all this very quickly. He understood that if he moved fast, it would reassure markets. And the system worked wonderfully. The United States could even borrow more. But history is rich with irony. As many of you know, Thomas Jefferson and the Virginians who followed Washington and Adams, they didn't like Hamilton's plan. They believed land was the source of wealth. They were big borrowers, many much heavily in debt, and they certainly didn't like banks. But when Thomas Jefferson decided to buy the Louisiana Territory, known in some regions of the world as the North Dakota Purchase, he had to do so, he could only do so because of Hamilton's bonds. The cost of the Louisiana Purchase was $15 million, of which $11.25 million was in payment. The rest was sort of picking up old debts. The total outlays in 1801 of the U.S. government were only $9.4 million. So the whole government outlays are $9.4. He has to pay $11.25. And of that $9.4, almost half were for interest on the set of existing bonds. Now, Napoleon, who was the seller, wanted gold and silver. He didn't want bonds. And so to add to the irony, a British bank, Barings, who handled U.S. bonds, gave gold and silver in exchange for the bonds, even though Britain was in the midst of fighting Napoleonic France. There was a lull in the period, but the British Treasury allowed them to give the gold and the silver. Now, we take this for granted, but the good credit of the United States was quite uncommon in the early 19th century. France, to continue the story, which had lent a lot of money to the United States, gets itself into a financial mix, sort of mess, and Louis XVI, the king, has to call the Estates General. That was to raise revenue, and that, of course, was the start of the French Revolution. During the 1820s and 40s, nearly half the world's countries were in default, as well as 9 U.S. states. The origin of balanced budget amendments, which you see in many states, comes from this period, where to assure debtors that they would sort of get repaid. And of course, good credit is most valuable when the country is most vulnerable. So in the U.S. Civil War of 1861 to 1865, the U.S. debt expanded from $64.8 million in 1860 to $2.8 billion in 1866 after the war was over. So when I studied the Civil War, of course, it was about armies and navies and generals and moving across the South. But a big picture was that the North was able to support much larger armies and militaries and supplies because it had the ability to borrow. The Confederacy didn't. Printed currency, large inflation, led to the economic collapse of the South. Of course, the good U.S. credit was also critical for the Allied victory in World Wars I and II, and in the European recovery after World War II. Now, by the time of the late 20th century, U.S. debt as a percentage of the overall economy, of GDP, ranged from 30 to 50%. With the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, it rose to 49% in 2007. In 2011, after the global financial crisis, the figure jumped to 80%. And then with the pandemic and deep recession that followed, it pushed it higher. So today, U.S. debt to GDP is about 99 to 100% of GDP. So we owe about as much as the economy produces in a year. And we're projected to blow through the highest peacetime limit, which was 106% in 1946. So as time goes on, our deficits are about a little bit over 6% of GDP this year, which is highly unusual if you're not in the midst of an emergency. And the Congressional Budget Office projects that they'll just continue to grow in the years ahead. The interest expense on U.S. debt now is about the same as the defense budget, or it's about the same as our Medicare payments. So Hamilton explained long ago that good credit is a key to national security. So consider it a form of insurance, or a buffer, or a cushion. And as you know, when confidence in credit breaks, it moves very, very quickly. So for my second story, let me jump 100 years to 1930. The Great Depression was just seizing the country. Congress thought it could isolate the U.S. economy by raising tariffs. That's just a fancy word for taxes on trade. The Smoot-Hawley bill, which otherwise known as the Tariff Act of 1930, raised the average tariff rate to 59.1%. In those days, Congress set the tariffs on each individual item. So they set tariff items on over 3,300 items. The average tariff for the country was probably in the mid-20s because there were some things that we didn't have a tariff on. We didn't put tariff on things that we didn't produce. Other countries retaliated. The value of U.S. trade fell about 70%. In quantity terms, it was 40 to 49% because of changes of the value of the dollar. And the world economy started to break into blocks as countries retreated into economic autarky. They were preparing for war. And while there are many causes for the Great Depression, primarily the economists among you will know it was probably seen now as monetary policy as the critical breakdown. But the breakdown in trade certainly deepened it. By the way, the United States had a trade surplus in the 1930s, but it also had unemployment of 25%. Nevertheless, only 4 years later, 1934, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who is a former congressman and senator from the state of Tennessee, persuaded Franklin Roosevelt to introduce what became known as the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934. It's only 3 pages long. For those of you that study anything about the U.S. government, there's nothing that's 3 pages long. This is amazing. For the book I wrote, I went back and looked at the bill. Indeed, it was only 3 pages long. But those 3 pages represented a huge shift. So from the start of the United States till 1930, Congress would set the individual tariffs on individual items. But what this act did is it changed the authority to the executive branch, allowing the executive branch to negotiate agreements to reduce tariffs by up to 50%. And so the state of play moved from Congress with individual tariffs defensively to the executive branch negotiating agreements to lower tariffs. And so over the next 10 years, Hull negotiated 31 agreements with 28 countries. He moved the tariffs down to the level below Smoot-Hawley, but just as important, each of the deals included some shared provisions about most favored nation treatment, what economists call national treatment, and those became the key principles for reviving the trading system after World War II. And so those negotiations were called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, and that eventually became what was known as the World Trade Organization in the 1990s. But trade negotiations were never, ever easy. Even in 1947, so right after World War II, with the US economy dominant, we represented about 50% of the world's production at that point, that GATT negotiation barely got off the ground. It involved 23 countries, but in the midst of the negotiation, Congress passed a 50% tariff on wool. And the Australians at that time, their major export was wool, threatened to walk out of the negotiations. Britain felt a responsibility to the Australians as a Commonwealth country. They said, well, if Australia goes, we go. And at that time, a lot of the European countries recovering from war were looking as much to the British or the American market, so they started to doubt the negotiations. So a man named Will Clayton, who was actually had been a very successful businessman in the cotton trade, was a key US negotiator. And so he flies all the way back from Geneva, Switzerland, to see President Truman to discuss this tariff bill. And Truman gives him 15 minutes, and he gives the Secretary of Agriculture 15 minutes. The Secretary of Agriculture says, Mr. President, you'll lose up to 7 states, wool-producing states, in the 1948 election if you don't sign this bill. And poor Will Clayton has to make the case about lowering tariffs to get the world economy going and sort of look to the future of growth. And Truman, the next day, agreed to veto the bill and even gave Clayton authority to cut tariffs 25%. So my point was, these tariff and trade negotiations are never easy politically. There's always somebody who sort of wants the course of protection. The Australians grumbled, but they went back to the table. And the first GATT round cut tariffs on 45,000 items, about half of the world trade. And by the way, for those of you that know a little bit about American political history, Truman actually won that 1948 election. So after that round, there were 8 successful GATT rounds over the next 50 years. And the United States added what are called free trade agreements, which are actually deeper because they seek to eliminate almost all tariffs, but also add rules for services, intellectual property, investment, environment, and labor. And the U.S. has free trade agreements with 20 countries today, the most prominent of which, you're well aware, is probably Mexico and Canada. In 2016, economists estimated the U.S. gains from post-World War II trade liberalization were about $2.1 trillion. So these are small cuts, but they make a big difference in growth over time. But the politics of trade has always been difficult because the benefits are widely distributed and the costs are often felt in particular industries that have to face competition. In most states, not North Dakota, they have more House members than they have senators. And so the House members normally have smaller districts, and they're normally more sensitive to the districts than the senators are. The senators have a wider range of economic interests and across the whole state. So the House members tend to be more protectionist than the senators. And the president is supposed to take the overall national interest, normally is the one over the 70 years that represented the importance of openness and lowering barriers and setting rules for the future, until 2017. So we now have had 2 presidents of both parties who have favored tariffs and basically avoided future trade deals. And now you see what you see in the newspaper today. President Trump has returned with office with proposals of much higher tariffs. In fact, they'll start tomorrow. And so this raises questions of costs and inflation and uncertainties in the marketplace. So when you think about imports, keep in mind about half of imports are for commodities or inputs. So every time you're raising tariffs, that means for the tractor factories here in Fargo or others, that means the cost of their inputs are sort of going to go up. You can raise steel prices, but it makes it more expensive for the auto producers. So you have to think not only of consumers, but you have to think about the inputs along the way. Now, of course, then there's retaliation. So in this state, you have a big agricultural industry. During President Trump's first term, you had a lot of retaliation, particularly from China on soybean industry. Cost farmers about $28 billion. There were about $22 billion of subsidies. The administration is now talking more subsidies. So from my point of view, blocking markets where farmers can earn on their own and instead subsidizing is probably not a win-win, but those are the political questions that we'll be sort of facing today. Of course, when I was trade representative, what you also saw was the changing nature of the world economy. So while manufactured goods and agriculture are important, about 1/4 of trade now is in the services industry. So I checked actually the North Dakota numbers. North Dakota has about $9 billion of exports, but about $1 billion are services industry. Your former governor came from the software industry, and that's part of the overall sort of services trade. The reason why that's important is that one of the reasons the U.S. pursued free trade agreements was because it extended the rules. The U.S. is always a cutting-edge economy, so whether it's intellectual property, whether it's different types of services, you wanted to come up with new rules for the new changing economy. Today, frankly, if I were a U.S. trade representative, I'd probably be focusing on the rules for digital and data, because there's not an industry in the world that doesn't rely on data transfers, and you want to try to make that as expeditious as possible. So Mark Twain was allegedly said, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. So that may be what we're dealing with today. So a third story involves more of my own personal experience. This is with President George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, and the push for North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, in the early 1990s. So some of you may know that Mexico lost about 1/3 to 1/2 of its territory to the United States in the War of 1846 to 1848. And this left Mexicans resentful for well over a century. There was a famous line, a prayer for Mexico. It says, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." So there wasn't a lot of love in this relationship. After the revolutions in Mexico in the early 20th century, Mexico became a one-party state and was governed by the PRI. It's a wonderful oxymoron. It was the Permanent Revolutionary Institutional sort of party was the name. And the model of the PRI really came from Europe in the 20s and 30s. It was a corporatist model. And what I mean by that was that the president was at the apex. The PRI had its hands in everything. Business, universities, sort of media, the states, the governors, the whole control of the system, unions. And so this system started to break down under international competition in the 1980s, and also Mexico had been relying heavily on its oil production, which started to go down, and Mexico faced a series of debt crises. So in the late 1980s, the Mexican president, Carlos Salinas, wanted to pursue economic reforms, possibly political reforms in Mexico as well. And he went to Davos, Switzerland for the annual conference in 1990. But what he discovered was, this was 1989-90, right at the end of the Cold War. People wanted to talk about Central and Eastern Europe. Nobody wanted to talk about Mexico. Investors had no interest in Mexico. So President Salinas figured on a bold move. He decided to negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States. Now, some of you may know, the US and Canada had just completed a very difficult free trade agreement negotiation in 1988. This had been tried a couple times, but Canada was always worried about, frankly, being overpowered by the US market. It had been a difficult negotiation, but the Prime Minister at the time, Brian Mulroney, was a good friend of President Reagan, and he believed that if Canadian industries could compete with the United States industries, they'd be globally competitive. So he's willing to subject his own economy to the challenges of competition. But the Mexican sensitivities were obviously much deeper than they were between Canada and the US, and it was still a developing economy. But for President Bush and my boss at the time, Secretary James Baker, NAFTA was about much more than a trade agreement. It was about a historical reconciliation across North America. Mexico was an emerging democracy with a developing world economy. And that old PRI political system, you could see that it was breaking down. And the question that we asked ourselves is, where would the pieces go? Would they become part of a new authoritarian system? Would they be oligarchs like in Russia? Would they be taken over by organized crime networks? And so the real strategy of NAFTA was to try to link Mexico's development to the United States and Canada, not just in terms of trade, but also in terms of civil society, in terms of schools and education, media, everything to connect it to be part of North America. And we had some important allies. During the flush days of Mexican oil, a lot of Mexicans had been sent to American universities, and they wanted to change the system. And in effect, they saw the NAFTA agreement as a way of importing the rule of law, making sure that if you're an investor in Mexico, that you could be assured that your property would be safe. And so we also perceived a strategy looking ahead. So this is the end of the Cold War, uncertain about what's going to happen in Europe and the Pacific. And we thought that North America as a continental base would be stronger for all three countries. So if you think about North America as a unit, it's about 500 million people, 3 democracies, better demographics if you recognize the potential of human capital, energy self-sufficiency and even the ability to export, advanced technology, deeper cooperation on a whole series of cross-border issues, and frankly, recognizing interest in other troublesome spots like Central America, which sends people to the United States, but also troubles the Mexican border. So President Bush managed to complete the NAFTA negotiations in 1992, just as he was sort of leaving office, and President Clinton passed it in 1993. Now, what turned out is the economic institutions of Mexico, especially the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, some of the regulators, these truly became sort of world-class institutions. And the United States helped Mexico not only look to the north, but also they joined the OECD, which is the group of developed economies club that's Europe and the United States and Australia. They joined APEC, which is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. And eventually something that could be called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the U.S., which in a sense drew from American free trade agreements. The United States was a key negotiator of it, but after 1916, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump didn't want to be part of it. So we withdrew from that, but Mexico was part of it. Mexico did create a multi-party democracy. Mexican immigration came way down because either people get jobs or they're going to leave. But other institutions, the police, unions, so local education, didn't reform as much or at all. So it was an ongoing mixed process in terms of the result. The social and economic ties were very, very strong that developed over North America. I was talking about the railroad lines here, and you not only have the east-west, but you also got the north-south. You got the, I think it's the Canadian Pacific that comes here with the Kansas City. And that's a whole railroad line system that's based on the supply chains of North America. President Trump renegotiated the NAFTA with something called the USMCA. He added some other provisions, particularly in the auto sector. Some of us thought that he would actually then support North American integration going forward. But again, you'll see that in the news. We'll see how that turns out. So far, it doesn't look like that's the path that we're on. It's a very different perspective. So just to give you one reference point. In 1979, when Ronald Reagan announced his campaign for presidency, remember, this is his opening speech to be elected president. He starts to talk about North America. He says, look, he said, we should want our nearest neighbors to be stronger, not weaker. I mean, if they're stronger, they'll buy more for us. It'll be healthier. And it's time that we stop seeing our nearest neighbors as foreigners. Well, that's kind of different than what you hear today. It's a very different outlook, and that's the challenge that we'll be facing going forward. So today, I wanted to use history a little bit to discuss debt and credit, trade, and regional integration. And you can see how these issues get connected with issues of economics and security and certainly politics and how they intersect. But I've also tried to give you a little bit of a feeling that these questions are not just historical. these are the ones that you see, for those of you that read newspapers or online, that are going on today. And so part of the debate that we'll all be dealing with is some people favor the notion of a fortress America with economic barriers. And this, of course, has challenges with the alliances that we built over 70 years with the alliance in the Pacifics. And on the budgetary and debt issue, neither party is facing this issue, which I think is probably going to be the most important one for the United States going forward. So my own concern, I'm an optimist by nature, but I don't think what we're doing now is going to turn out so well. We'll see. Markets haven't exactly been so excited, but times may change. But the challenge, in a sense, for some of the students that you're supporting here, and I had a chance to talk with Professor Bitson's class, is that this will be the challenge for them. Somebody's going to have to remake this over time. And part of the value of institutions like North Dakota State and the Challey Institute is to introduce people to these ideas, and so they can make up their own mind, frame their own system. A final thought, just a personal one, and that is that I've always believed that sort of America's trump card is its openness. Its openness to goods, to investment, to ideas, to people, legal immigration, I might add. And if I think about sort of the story of North Dakota, this is a state that was developed by the railroads. This is a state that was developed by immigration. The benefits of these is that any country, any society makes mistakes. But open ones are forced to confront their mistakes, and they're forced to learn along the way. And I think that's the important benefit of open societies. I've worked overseas with, I don't know, I must have been to 150 different countries in these different jobs. So I've seen lots of different places. And America is an incredibly gifted country in terms of our resources, our technology, the spirit of innovation, which this institute helps represent, and people. So we shouldn't be fearful. We could reshape the 21st century just as we did the 20th. But in my view, we won't do it by cutting ourselves off. America's strength is, frankly, representing something better around the world. We make mistakes like other people do, but all I can tell you is, when my experience around the world is that, people traditionally have wanted to be friends of the United States, and they certainly don't want to be our enemy, and that's probably a good position to be in. So, why don't I stop with that, and we'll take your questions later.
Thanks, Bob. You gave us a lot to think about, and I think a lot of people think about the economics of trade, but maybe don't think as much as they should about the relationships and the institutions that were built and the trust and all of those important aspects as well. We're going to talk more about trade, but I want to start out just by, you have a very distinguished public service career, and your resume, so the bio that I read is a very, very, very small fraction of the things that you've done, all the positions you've held, all the accomplishments that you have had. So, for example, you're somebody who obviously doesn't like to brag, but you were involved in a lead negotiator in reunification of Germany, involved lead negotiator in the NAFTA agreement that you talked about, and in the Uruguay round of the general agreements on tariffs and trade, and a wide variety of regional trade agreements as U.S. trade representative. So is there one thing in your public service career that you're most proud of?
Do you do memorial events? You're doing a really good job. I don't know. I don't have a specific date, but maybe if we could keep that fluid about different things. Look, I had some wonderful opportunities, but one reason I wrote this book, which as you came in, was when I was doing all these things, I often drew upon history. And I talked a little bit about this with your class, kind of give you a perspective and think about things. And my experience has been that many classes on foreign policy these days now are taught using international relations theory. And if some of you are political science professors, please bear with me. I always found it to be interesting, but it wasn't as practical. And so one of the reasons I wrote the book was to try to help younger generations think about how to use history and problem solve. So with the book, if you try it, it's a multiple biography. It's about people and events. and it's kind of how people solve the problems of their day. Now, some of you may know Henry Kissinger wrote a book titled Diplomacy in the 1990s. He used history, but he used European history. And so what I wanted to do in this book was to focus on stories from American history. And having had these various jobs and having assistants over the years, I never knew how much history students learned anymore. And so I used to torture them a little bit by asking if they knew various things. And I learned that insofar as they'd learned any history, it was kind of from World War II on. And the first 150 years are pretty darn interesting in terms of, and including things like the sort of the interwar period. So you mentioned German unification. This was, I was a secondary role to President Bush and Secretary Baker, but this moved very, very quickly in the course of about 11 months. And it was, as you and I have discussed, the US was a little bit ahead of the curve. What I often talk about, whether it's markets or whether it's policymaking, you can anticipate, prediction's very hard. Prediction specific things is very hard, but you can anticipate trends. And we could see in early '89 that the ice of the Cold War was breaking. And so we were basically trying to position ourselves to work closely with Germany. This caused a little trouble with Margaret Thatcher, whose view about Germany was she liked it so much that she liked two of them. She wasn't a big fan of German unification. But at the same time that we felt we were keeping faith with an ally, there was something deeper. This is, you realize that the world was going to be changing and Germany would be important, which by the way, you can see it again today, with the importance of Germany. And we wanted that partnership. We wanted to have maintain the NATO alliance, and we thought whatever came in the future, this was an important relationship to have. So that one turned out pretty well. And but now again, as we're discussing it, we'll see whether NATO exists 2 or 3 years from now. And this is a huge shift, okay? So part of it, I speak sometimes to various foreign policy audiences. We all get used to assumptions about the system. But a lot of those are in flux now. I mean, so just to give you two, there was an assumption over the past 70 years that countries weren't allowed to take over other states by force in their territory, okay? So the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, which I was also involved with the coalition we put together, that was Saddam Hussein overrunning Kuwait, and President Bush decided that shouldn't stand. In part because he didn't want, with the end of the Cold War, to move to some jungle of people conquering countries. But if you see what's going on now with Russia, Ukraine, frankly, if you some of the things in the Middle East, the borders are changing with some of them with some of the African countries, and for God's sakes, we're not talking about Greenland. I mean, where did we get off on this stuff? So that's a very big assumption, and it's connected to another one. So frankly, the world, our allies got used to the fact that we had a nuclear umbrella. If they no longer have confidence in the US security guarantee, you can be darn sure you're going to have more countries develop nuclear weapons. So some of you may know when you started to have nuclear proliferation in the 60s, experts sort of forecast there'd be a lot more countries that had nuclear weapons by now than have had. Big reason they didn't is the US sort of tried to dampen it down, and US offered the security. In Korea, South Korea, 70% of the public wants to have a nuclear weapon. If they can't trust the United States, they'll go nuclear. And by the way, if you ask yourself, even though the Japanese have an understandable allergy to nuclear weapons, if they've got Russia, China, North Korea, South Korea, all with nuclear weapons, what do you think is going to happen in Tokyo? The Poles are talking about it. So my point of this is more just to get people to recognize you got big shifts going on here, and be careful because with some of the things that may turn out may not be to your liking.
Yeah, so it's really something to think about. Just retreating from international institutions is a concern. Going back to your book, just one other, everyone has a copy of your book, and Bob has said that he will autograph as many people that would like to have an autograph of the book after. You have a lot of interesting figures that maybe people have not heard of before. So you mentioned Cordell Hull earlier and Will Clayton, also Elihu Root and Vannevar Bush and Charles Evans Hughes. So is there a favorite story in the book, and maybe something that, maybe a story that's influenced your approach to public service at all?
Well, the last clause threw me off. So obviously, I think Alexander Hamilton was brilliant, and we better not blow that one. But it's more a method. So it's natural that people look for historical analogies, but they can often mislead. I tend to draw upon history more to ask questions. Think about the flow of time. What insight can you draw on this? And one of the figures you mentioned, who's kind of probably lost to most people, is Charles Evans Hughes. Very intriguing man. This man was governor of New York. He was a Supreme Court justice. He loses the 1916 election to Woodrow Wilson by about 3,000 votes in California. He otherwise would have been president. He becomes Secretary of State. Later, he becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, quite famous in that capacity. But in 1921, when he becomes Secretary of State, recall, the Senate had just rejected the Versailles Treaty of Woodrow Wilson. So senators of Hughes's own party say, it doesn't matter who's Secretary of State, we're going to run everything anyway. That's his own party. It's a nice place to start from. And so a lot of what I've tried to talk about is how people solve problems in a practical way. He recognizes that with the United States not having signed the Versailles Treaty, we got some leftover international business. So one of them, of course, is we didn't have peace with Germany. And so he very shrewdly takes a resolution that the Senate had passed and combines it with the parts of the Versailles Treaty that just dealt with Germany and makes that into the treaty, okay? It's a very practical way. Now, what I write about in the book is there was a movement, there was a disappointment after World War I. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars. You had a lot of spending actually on battleships for the Navy. And so there's a movement, a kind of a peace movement that's going to cut the Navy's budget. And you've got a series of issues of regional security in the Pacific with Japan and various islands, so on and so forth. So what Hughes does is he basically combines the naval arms control issue with the regional security issue and invites people to a conference in Washington that runs a couple months. The first thing is he uses his speech to kind of really set the stage. Most people are used to opening speeches to say, hello, how are you? We're going to have a nice meeting. But he basically puts out specifics about what's supposed to happen with battleships. Second, to come up with that proposal, he's got to bring the Navy along. So how does he do that? Right? So it's a question of arms control negotiation. Third, he's got to have a delegation. Remember, the Senate just ignored what Wilson did. So he's very smart. He brings the leading Democrat from the Foreign Relations Committee, the leading Republican, and Elihu Root, who had been Secretary of War and Secretary of State too. These four are the key negotiators in the process. And so it's partly the story of how he puts together that negotiation and accomplishes something in a practical way. And what I try to include in the book are some wonderful little insights. So, of course, at that time, as in many times, the French were causing him trouble. So he starts the negotiation, and the French say, oh, yes, we'll come to the negotiation, but the text must be in French as well as English, or the negotiations. Okay. And so then they finally finish the agreement, and he has it published in French and English, and the French say, we want the French on this side, not on that side. And anybody who's been in a negotiation knows this feeling. These guys have been killing himself for 2 months, and he's about ready to say, the hell with this. And then finally, Henry Cabot Lodge says, yeah, what difference does it make, right? And so, yeah, okay, give them the language, right? So if you're part of negotiations, there's often a moment where that comes. You've been killing yourself and you're just tired of that. And so what I partly try to do about this is to bring these people back to life, to show that these are real people and kind of, how you deal with those issues. Now, the missing part of history, of course, is this was a period where Japan was kind of trying to decide its international role after World War I. And there was a view in Japan that, frankly, after the destruction of Imperial Germany and the suffering of France, that the future powers would be Britain, the United States, and Japan would, in a sense, be a commercial power. But in 1929, 1930, that starts to change with the role of the Japanese imperialists. Then you get the the market crash, you get the recession, and Japan turns to the notion of an imperial power and sort of will dominate sort of Asia, the autarky of this development. So in a sense, the agreement fails. It doesn't last very long. The United States has to rebuild the Navy. By the way, the Congress never did appropriate the money even to build up to the levels that we had. So we didn't give anything away in the process. So, part of it is the kind of, in much of diplomacy, the message is, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Okay, I mean, theorists can tell you have to have everything put together. If you can advance whatever the agenda is strategically for your country, in my view also economically as well as security terms, that's a good day's work. And so each of these stories, if you start the book, you'll see the opening is Ben Franklin. And so to give you a little connection, the book has been translated into Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and Georgian, because a professor in Georgia wanted, by the way, this is the other Georgia, not the one in here, wanted to share with their students. And so I was in China about a month ago, and they were interviewing me about the book. And I'm trying to show, okay, what's the relevance of Ben Franklin, in 1780, 77, 78 for China. But I said, look at what this is. This is a story about moving from war to peace. That's kind of relevant today, right? He had to negotiate with his own colleagues. He had this wonderful quote about John Adams saying, always an intelligent man, often a wise one, but in some things and in some situations, almost totally out of his mind. Okay, so he has to deal with his own delegation. He's got to negotiate with allies. He had the French. He's got Congress. And by the way, the Congress said, don't make a move unless the French agree. Well, why did that happen? Because the French representative got Congress to sort of do that. Okay? And they eventually moved without the French. Okay? For some of you that read about public diplomacy, Ben Franklin is the inventor of public diplomacy. I mean, Ben Franklin had lived in Britain before. And as you may know, because of his scientific knowledge, he was given honorary degrees from Edinburgh and Oxford and so on and so forth. The portraits of Franklin in Britain are of this very educated, well-dressed man. He's in France, all of a sudden he's the rustic American, okay? So he's no wig, he wears brown sort of clothes, and the French love style, right? So he's creating this sense of the style, the sort of the revolutionary sort of rustic. And he uses this to kind of develop America's image abroad. And there's a wonderful quote at the end. And by the way, espionage. So you can't make this stuff up. History is so rich. It turns out one of his members of his delegation, his secretary, is a British spy. Okay? So when they sign the agreement, the guy sends the information to London in advance and shorts the market. Okay, so he can take advantage of the market sort of going down in this stuff. But at the end, one of Franklin's colleagues says to him, your country owes you a great debt of gratitude and, sort of be eternally grateful. And Franklin scoffs and he says, in my experience, he said, somebody's always disappointed in a peace negotiation. And the notion in the Bible of blessed are the peacemakers may be in the next life, but not in this one. So the part of it is, these are real people. And it's interesting to see how they dealt with the challenges of their era.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I think people thought that you put a bunch of y'alls when it was translated into Georgian. Anyway, but anyway,
we call that the Southern plural, is what we call it.
So let's talk about trade a little bit. I mean, you've negotiated reducing barriers to trade worldwide, and it's had tremendous benefits, and global prosperity has increased tremendously. There have been over 1 billion people lifted out of poverty. There's been increasingly positive relations between nations and cooperation between nations. But there's a growing sentiment among a group of people in the United States and elsewhere that trade is zero-sum, the idea that the only way one country benefits from trade is at the expense of others. And unfortunately, I think even the current Trump administration believes that. The way that the reciprocal tariffs are put in place are based on trade deficits. If we have a trade deficit, somebody must be unfair. So how can we renew an appreciation in America and the positive role that trade plays, and while recognizing that there are some people that are displaced by trade?
So I've struggled with this issue for many years because, as I said in the remarks, trade, like technology, requires change. Okay, and some people are hurt by change. Some people are afraid of change. And you have to help people adapt to change, which is the critical part. But I remember thinking about this recently. I was trade representative from 2001 to 2005. And when I'm testifying before Congress and trying to talk, people are saying they're worried about losing jobs. One of the problems with trade and innovation is you're really defending the future where other people are defending the past, okay? So I couldn't say, oh, by the way, there'll be something called the iPhone invented in a couple years, and it'll develop all sorts of applications, and there'll be all sorts of jobs created to it. That's the nature of an innovative sort of changing system. So, I mean, so the scoundrel's answer to your question is, we now have a test. Okay, people will see how this works. Okay, and here's my forecast to you. One, prices are going to go up at a time that people were worried about inflation. That, by the way, is going to make the Federal Reserve jobs harder, because looking at this audience, you're all too young, but in the 1970s, there was something called stagflation, where you had a slowdown plus inflation. It wasn't pleasant, okay? So, we may be on the board of that. Costs are going to go up. As I mentioned, 50% of imports are for inputs and things like that. So, whether it's the auto industry now, particularly in North America, as you've read, the parts and the cars cross the border 7 or 8 or 9 times. It's an integrated market. You're going to charge a tax every time you cross. Then you got retaliation. So I mentioned the case for North Dakota, your farm products, but you're also going to see it in terms of some of the energy prices that are going forward. And by the way, if the economy slows down, what do you think that'll do to the energy prices that have helped boost North Dakota with the Bakken area? So all these pieces are sort of interconnected. And then, again, this depends on your own judgment, but I have to scratch my head. Do we really have to get in an economic war with the Canadians and Mexicans? I mean, this is nuts. I mean, in my experience, the Canadians, they say a boot, but otherwise they're pretty similar in terms of what we think about it. And, I even think, there was this story about the Canadians in Iran who basically brought in the American diplomats, from you might have seen the movie about it, who sort of saved them. The Canadians, we have different views. They have dairy supports, people don't like some of the softwood lumber. They claim it's subsidized, but come on, let's put this in the bigger perspective here. And great tensions. The hardest part for me to see actually is kind of a sense of whether the United States word is good. I mean, you have differences, you negotiate, but now all of a sudden you throw all the agreements out the window and everything is a new negotiation. Well, are they going to trust you if the last time you didn't have a negotiation? And then, and frankly, what you're now seeing is the Chinese, they're not going to miss a beat on this. They're taking advantage of it. They're saying, oh, well, we're reliable. You need to do business with us. And so I think part of it will be kind of people may have to see the costs. That's why I used the story of 1930 to 34. You saw what happened in that context. Okay. Now, but you also sort of say, okay, how do you support this? Okay. And I think a critical part is you have to help people adapt to change. Okay. There are different There's been various worker adjustment programs. A lot of them haven't worked as well, trade adjustment assistance. Sometimes, in my experience, it's probably best to give the money or support to individuals directly. There was even something that I once looked at called the idea of wage insurance, which the idea is that you by and large want to get people back in the private sector workforce. You don't want to subsidize. So let's say somebody's making $60,000 a year and they can only find a job at $40,000. And they may wait, okay. But is it better maybe to make up some of that 20,000 difference for some period of time to encourage people to get back into the workforce, so keep their skills going? It's worth it to me if you sort of keep an open sort of system. There's a certain craziness, but we were talking in your class about artificial intelligence and how the market's going to get transformed. On the one hand, America's got these huge advantages. And frankly, we're in a position to shape the future of the world economy. So how do we think we're going to do this by sort of retreating and building barriers? Then the last point where politics come in is that I think one reason I negotiated a lot of these free trade agreements was that I found it easier for members of Congress to vote for a relationship with a country than kind of an overall agreement. So are you for a deal with Australia? Do you like Australia? Or if it's, I negotiated a lot with some of the Middle Eastern countries, Morocco and Jordan and Oman and others. Do you want to have some partnership with them? South Korea, as a country. And so that sometimes made the voting a little bit easier. So maybe, for example, since Britain left the EU, might you do a special deal with Britain and strengthen the transatlantic relationship, the aspect. So you always have to, as a trade negotiator, figure out the politics of support. And bringing it back to agriculture, the agriculture community was very important for the trade community because North Dakota is a good example of this. Agriculture production is not a huge part of the economy, but there's a lot of farm states. Each of those farm states have 2 senators. That means you can tend to get support if you got the support of the farm community. And so, as we were talking about, one of the issues that you'll hear debated in the farm community is, do you want to lose your markets and rely on subsidies, or would you rather compete in export sort of markets? Those will be the questions people have to face.
Yeah. So I have one more question on international trade, and then we'll have questions from the audience. I want to leave time for questions from the audience, so please start lining up there. But one of the questions I have is, so you were U.S. Trade Representative. When you were U.S. Trade Representative, you finalized the negotiations for China to enter the World Trade Organization. And that's yielded many benefits for the world, benefits for the United States. Our consumers have lower priced, high quality goods. Our manufacturers have low priced, high quality component parts. We have lower interest rates because of Chinese investment in U.S. treasuries. We have a huge market that you just talked about for soybeans and other agricultural and other products. But people have recognized some concerns with Chinese trade, heavy state involvement in trade and investment, the forced technology transfer of some companies in China, intellectual property theft. So how can we continue the benefits to have a beneficial, positive trading relationship with China while addressing some of these concerns without getting into a trade war, which it looks like we're already getting into with China?
So let me give you some context on this. Some people even go further back and they say, look, we shouldn't have supported China's rise. To be honest, we didn't really have a choice. Okay, once Deng Xiaoping decided he was going to open up and modernize China in 1979, if the United States had said, oh, well, we don't want that to happen, I don't think it would have stopped it. So the real question is, do you want to try to shape sort of, this is why we brought China into the World Trade Organization. Many people don't recognize that when China came into the World Trade Organization, we didn't change any of our barriers. Okay? We didn't offer anything different than it had been available before. China had to make a series of reductions. Okay? And as you said, the devil is always in the details of implementation. If you look closely at this, China was pretty good at the quantitative requirements, reducing tariffs and other barriers. Not so good on the qualitative ones, like intellectual property rights and forced technology transfer in particular. So then the question would be, do you decide that you want to keep pressing them on those, and that's where you may want to put in some threat of tariffs or sanctions or other things, or do you kind of want to give up on them? I was in Shenzhen about a month ago in southern China, a big technology area, and I was just struck that one of the buildings was talking about intellectual property. So guess what? As they develop and move up the scale, all of a sudden they want to develop more intellectual property rights. Okay, and they had actually, under some pressure, they started to put in intellectual property rights courts, but the penalties weren't high enough. So this is where you kind of have to sort of keep pressing on those issues. The big problem when China first came in the WTO was frankly the exchange rates. The Chinese exchange rate was too low, and that's helped the Chinese exports. Under Hank Paulson, they started to change that and increase the exchange rate, and actually their overall global surplus actually started to come down to zero, but it's now sort of expanded again. But one also has to be aware of what are the security issues. So to share with you another story, Deng Xiaoping, the current president of China, I had gotten to know him when he was a rising party secretary in Hangzhou. And he visited me at the State Department. I then later visited him. This is in Zhejiang province. And then he was vice president for a while, and I would see him. And this was while I was at the World Bank. I was leaving the World Bank in 2012, just as he was moving up. And the World Bank had done a study with China about the next stage of reform, how to avoid the middle income trap. And because China, frankly, needed structural reforms then, it frankly still needs structural reforms now. See it slow down in different ways. And so I'm sitting down with Xi, and I didn't have a chance to have a seminar. I had a chance to ask a couple questions. And so I said, Mr. President, what's your top economic priority and development priority? And he said, he was always straightforward with me. He said, the 86.68 million members of the Communist Party. And I remember because the numbers are transversed. And so today I think there were 95, 96 million. So by this time I'd dealt with a lot of prime ministers and presidents and chancellors. Not one, if I'd asked them their economic priorities, would have given me their party membership. And that's kind of a clue as to where he was going, okay? So, I don't think Xi, frankly, ever understood the economy as much as Li Keqiang and others there. The technocrats that I worked with have now been kind of sort of pushed to the side. And you can see one of China's problems is it's relying too much on sort of the investment in infrastructure. For a while, housing, and the housing prices came down. And consumption as a percentage of GDP in China is about 39%. In the US, it's about 70% in most developed countries. So that's why they're either relying on exports or investment. So what I'd probably be focused on with China today would be, it's in their own self-interest sort of to change that structure. Now, at the same time, you've got a security threat. So I'm not naive about that. I've been through a few conflicts. But so what does that mean? It means you ought to invest in the US military, and you ought to make sure that your allies are good partners. By the way, why are we getting into trade wars with Japan and Korea and Australia if that's supposed to be our alliance partners, okay? So this is a good example of kind of, problems aren't easily subject to mathematical solutions. You need deterrence, you need alliance relationships, but you also have to decide what's in your economic interest. And by the way, in technology, you may want to put export controls, as we're doing with some top-end stuff, but don't fool yourself. As you know, innovation keeps moving, so it may give you 4 or 5 years in advance, but the Chinese will figure out a way to get to it as well. And then you have to decide, was that 3 or 4 or 5 years worth the loss of sales of those companies and issues? So these are the difficult trade-offs on these problems.
Yeah, thank you.
And by the way, you have a Chinese student here as part of the Institute, and I'm really glad to see this, because one of the things I worry about is that the connection between the two societies is now lessening. And I mentioned I was in China recently, and I was with some Chinese. They look young to me, which now means in the 30s or 40s, I guess. And look, a lot of these had been studied in the US or studied in Britain, so on and so forth. They understand they're living in a repressed society. They like the United States. They think we're going through the Cultural Revolution here. This is what they're thinking, because it's the leadership overthrowing the elites and so on and so forth in a fashion. And it's sad to lose those ties, because by and large, if you invite Chinese here, okay, there may be some spies, but by and large, these are people who are hardworking. They want to get ahead. They want to learn from the United States. And we, at a minimum, we should not let this lapse into conflict.
I agree. Again, if there's questions, people please come up and ask them.
And maybe give me your name and where you're from or anything.
Sure. Hi, I'm Todd Pringle. I'm an adjunct here at NDSU, and I do a few other things. I'm curious about demography, and it seems to me when you're looking at a trade agreement, it's future-oriented. When you think about credit, it's future-oriented. Everything is sort of predicated on growth. Korean fertility rate is like 0.6, which is to say for every 2 humans, you're going to get a little more than half a human, which is to say 70% reduction in total population in a generation. It's astonishing, and it's happening all over the developed world, and China included. How do you make a stable world trade organization? How do you, I don't mean the brand, I mean just world trade. How do you look at international banking if the total addressable market every year shrinks in terms of to the extent that humans are buying goods. I mean, we try to, individual humans try to sell them more stuff for sure, but demography seems like a gorilla in the room that other than the Peter Zehans of the world, it seems like it's not addressed, and it seems like structurally it's way bigger than climate change. I'm curious what your thoughts of that and how that incorporates into what's going on right now.
I very much agree with you. I'm part of various investment groups around the world, and when I'm trying to help them look ahead, one of the key points I mentioned is demography. Okay, and you properly mentioned, in a way, Japan and Korea are kind of the forerunners of what we're going to see in the developed world. Now that, and China, by the way, this is quite striking. In the past 5 or 6 years, the Chinese birth rate and marriage rate has absolutely tumbled. It's below what it was during Mao's famines. It's below what it was in Russia from like 89 to 95. Frankly, as a political economist, that signals something's going on there, right? This is not a confident society if you have those sort of numbers. So the first thing I made a brief reference to this in my pitch for North America. Our demographics are better, okay? So, why are we making a winning hand into a losing hand, okay? Why not sort of take advantage of people? I get it, we want to control the borders. I'm all for that, okay? But, this interesting little experience from North Dakota, okay? So I was out in the western part and to see Teddy Roosevelt Park, and here in town, I now discovered that I have to make sure I say to somebody, do I want my room cleaned, okay? Because there's no people hired to clean rooms anymore, okay? Well, come on. I mean, what do we were telling people they can't have jobs here, but on the other hand, you don't have people to do things that Americans won't do, okay? So, so use the demographics sort of effectively, okay? But then let me flip it. There was a story in The Economist recently that in sub-Saharan Africa, the working age labor force in a couple years will exceed all of what is in the developed world, and within a couple more years, it'll exceed what is in China. Okay, so there the story is either you grow or get ready for a lot of people to come. Okay, so it's the other side of the immigration story. Now, as sort of an economic matter, kind of from an investor point of view, well, what is it? Number one, you better pay attention to pension and savings, right? And you're going to get sort of different risk profiles of people. Probably robots are going to become really important, and you already sort of see in Japanese society. And so I think that part of this will also represent what I was talking about, the changing nature of the service industry. So again, as I drive across sort of North Dakota, okay, people talk about wanting to bring back manufacturing. By the way, good luck on that for various reasons, because manufacturing as a share is going to go down. But what do I see is I see all the services, the hospital, education, different types of things. That's what people are spending more of the GDP on. So we should sort of be advanced in those sort of aspects of society. So you're exactly right. I mean, it's got to be factored into kind of what the planning is. And bringing us back to my little story about debt, I suppose we ought to give a little thought to kind of the fact that we keep adding to our debt at the time that our demographics are sort of looking the other way, right? So some of you may know the way the Medicare and Social Security trust funds are set up is kind of an awkward accounting, but they count the money that is actually from those taxes, even though money is also paid out of general revenues. But they're going to go through their trust funds by early 2030s. So then we'll have a sort of political issue. So you're exactly right. Fortunately, we have young people here in North Dakota.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Randy Wimmer, and I'm a retired small businessman and a retired military. It's interesting to me some of the things that might be below the radar of all the bluster and chaos in our daily news. For instance, I believe in Iraq, today, there's 101 members of a trade delegation meeting there, and they're discussing energy, tech, and health. and industries that just to spur on the Iraqi economy. And I'm wondering if you think their economy is still an emerging economy or it's well beyond that. They're expanding their ports. They're doing quite a number of things.
So I think it's primarily still an energy-driven economy. That's the basis for kind of a lot of the government earnings. But what your question raises is something that we actually discussed in Professor Vincent's class, which is in the field of development. When I was at the World Bank, in addition to recognizing countries are at different stages of development, you have to pay attention to countries that are called fragile states or post-conflict states, because if you don't have security, it's really hard to have an economy. So we talked about the sort of the Haiti example. And yet, not surprisingly, each of these professions has their own sort of approach. The security people do one way, the economic people the other way, the governance people. So I use the example that the security people in a place like Haiti or Afghanistan or anywhere else would sort of say, look, get the young men jobs, so otherwise someone's going to put on bombs, or they'll form part of gangs. But then the economists would say, well, you're going to distort the labor and wage rate for future investments, okay? So you're going to have to, you figure out in between things like food for work programs or other ways to kind of give people a stake in the society, give them some economic livelihood, while also trying to build the economy for the future. And that's a devilishly difficult problem if you think about kind of these problems of security, economics, and governance. Colombia did a pretty good job with the help of the United States, and now, unfortunately, the current president is probably letting some of that slip. Okay? Obviously, we're all concerned about people coming from Central America. This is the story of Central America. So I negotiated a free trade agreement with Central America. Okay, it was hardly going to threaten the United States economy. I was mainly interested in it to try to reduce barriers across the markets, draw in some investments, create some opportunity, and because it sounded like NAFTA, which had become politically unpopular, people voted against CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. But how are you going to deal with that issue unless you've got some security, some anti-corruption, some governance, and some economic opportunity, right? And so your question is a good example of, in many parts of the world, the challenge will be how do you integrate those together.
Good evening. My name is Robert Krebs. I'm a second-year student at Concordia. The current administration, before implementing the current tariff regime, was reportedly discussing the idea of reciprocal tariffs, meaning the negotiation with other countries to sort of reduce tariffs down to zero through coercive measures. Obviously, this has gone out the window because the current regime implements a 10% universal tariff.
Right.
But does a reciprocal tariff as a coercive strategy, is that theoretically effective as a strategy?
So, very good question. And let me use a little bit of history on this. So, President Trump also talks about President McKinley, because when McKinley was a congressman, he put on the McKinley tariff. What he overlooks is that when President McKinley became President McKinley, he actually urged reciprocity in trade. And to add to, in this case, the sad sense of irony, he was assassinated while speaking in an exposition where he was talking about trade with Latin America. So you can see that trade jobs are risky jobs. So I mentioned the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of '34, okay? And so that was the language used, but the logic of the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act was we will lower tariffs together, okay, so that you could lower U.S. tariffs and other countries would lower their tariffs. The way this came up in the recent months, and I have a pretty good insight on this, is that the head of the National Economic Council is a guy named Kevin Hassett, who I've known over the years. He's the reasoned economist. I think I'm not trying to say this in a courteous way, in a world where the president wanted to do tariffs, he was trying to think of a way of, well, how could I steer this in a way that maybe is more bargaining than sort of leads to barriers? And how can I give it an intellectual cover, okay? But if you, as you properly pointed out, if you see what they've proposed, it's not based on the notion of reciprocity. One starting point, which I've kind of alluded to today, is they only looked at the goods trade. They didn't look at the services trade, where the United States actually has a surplus. So that would be sort of part of the overall sort of calculation. And actually, I read a piece in the Wall Street Journal right before coming here. To make it look analytical, they came up with some Greek numbers and letters, and they referenced various studies, and one of the professors that did the study said, well, they misapplied these numbers. It should be one-fourth of what they're sort of talking about. It is kind of it was a game thing to look up at the bilateral trade deficits and then produce the amount. And so, by the way, developing countries get hit particularly hard with this because they, in the case of, say, Vietnam, okay, Vietnam doesn't buy as much advanced machinery which is more where the U.S. produces. It doesn't buy as much, and the services that it buys doesn't count. So it had a very large bilateral trade deficit, so it got a very hard tariff from them. But even to give me an opportunity to do a slight tangent, one of the other supposed justifications about this is sort of American manufacturing. I bet it would shock all of you to know that the value added of American manufacturing exceeds that of Germany, Japan, South Korea, and India combined. Okay? Now, how is that? Well, what's happened is manufacturing has moved to higher end stuff. It's more complicated materials. So you've got some tractor and you've got some other types of construction equipment here in the sort of Fargo area. That's more sophisticated machinery, okay? American workers are more productive. So they frankly get much higher wages for making that type of machinery. And so another good example was the machinery manufacturing exports in the United States from 2001 to 2021 doubled. Okay. Now, what else has happened though, and this is what we kind of alluded to, is you think about the movement of farming to manufacturing in American history. So in 1900, 40% of Americans are involved in farming. Now it's 1% to 2%, but they're far more productive. And I had to look this up recently for something else I did. After World War II, from 47 to 2016, the average hours worked in agriculture fell 80%. Our production tripled. That's productivity, okay? Now, what you're then seeing is that happening in the manufacturing industry, okay? And so you have, I think, 10% of the workforce now in manufacturing. And by the way, what is manufacturing? If half the value of a car is the software, is it manufacturing? Or is that, so is it just bending metal, or what does it has to be? And as we were talking about, what you're now seeing is, of course, there's only so many goods that people have and buy, so they're spending more on healthcare, education, entertainment, other types of activities. Where, by the way, the U.S. is quite competitive in the advantage. So why are we throwing this away? So I did a little riff here, but the point is these are manufactured numbers. Okay, and to be honest, since we're now in real time, the president likes tariffs. And he thinks it's a tool, and he thinks he can negotiate and club. And maybe what you noticed, for those of you that watch markets closely, the markets recovered this morning and then they fell. Okay, well, why was that? That was because basically there was the hint that we'll actually negotiate based on this. But we'll have to see. I mean, my own guess is that, the president would not be happy with a world of zero tariffs. I'd be happy with a world of zero tariffs, but I don't think he would. So we'll see what happens. But meanwhile, you've got people trying to make investment decisions and people trying to figure out supply chains, and they don't know what to do, okay? And I'll add one other one to you just to give you a sense of the picture. Because I deal with investors around the world, investors in Europe and Asia for the first time have come to me and said, Bob, can we trust the rule of law in the U.S.? I never thought I'd hear that. I never thought I'd hear that. That was one thing, people have different views, but they just don't know what the rules are going to be now, okay? So, we'll see, but I don't think this is on a good path.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Paul Jensen, and I come from Denmark. So,
Sorry.
yeah, that's what I was thinking too, but I'm going to ask on behalf of the many people that I know back home, what is the infatuation with the United States wanting to have Greenland? Because you've had access since whenever, almost, collaboration with the Danish government forever. Is it because we have nice ice bears, or, there's of course a security issue, I know all that. And you've had opportunities, I think 15 bases or 20 bases in the past, and now there's one left. So what's your take on this? What's the idea about wanting to take over Greenland?
So if you read my book,
Which I will.
one of the things you'll discover was that Secretary of State Seward, who was the Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, known for buying Alaska, right? He actually also wanted to buy Greenland, Iceland, Hawaii, the Danish Virgin Islands, and he was kind of had the vision of thinking about some form of Panama Canal. He did get Alaska, and the Danish Virgin Islands, as you may know, were sold in 1960.
Yeah.
And by the way, he wanted British Columbia, and because this is these wonderful little sort of ironies of history. For those of you that didn't study Canadian history in school, Canada was formed in 1867. That year is important. Why is it? Civil War had ended in 1865. The United States kept worrying that Britain and France were going to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. And one of the reasons that they kept out was they thought that if the U.S. lost the South, it might sort of move north. So London was a little worried about an angry Washington or U.S. in the aftermath. So they took at that time, the Canadian colonies and provinces and made the Canadian Confederation. And so they started with the 4 eastern ones. And then you had British Columbia on the west. And there were only like 20,000 people living in British Columbia. And there was a movement in British Columbia to join the United States, which at that time I would have actually kind of liked. It's a beautiful place. But the eastern provinces said, what do you want to come with us? And they said, well, helps with some of our debts, by the way, that old debt issue. And we want a railway. So just like the Northern Pacific, they built the Canadian Northern Railway to British Columbia. But the point would be to be charitable. And by the way, President Truman was also interested in sort of acquiring Greenland. From a point of view of sort of continental periphery, the U.S. obviously has an interest in Greenland's security, and particularly with melting in the Arctic and others now. As you properly point out, Denmark and the United States have been allies in NATO, good partners. The Danes will be supportive of whatever we want to create. People in Greenland will as well. So yeah, that would make more sense than the game that we're playing now. But you asked for an explanation. It's real estate terms. It's kind of power terms. It's bullying. In all sincerity, I feel very bad because I worked a lot with Danes over the years. During some of the war on terrorism, Danes were good supporters. Danes got attacked on different things, and so it's a travesty.
Yeah. Can I ask one more question?
Sure, that one was
Thank you.
good.
Having spent some time in Africa and Middle East, I was wondering about the many World Bank projects that have been financed in those parts of the world. How are they going to fare with these tariffs that we're trying to introduce? Because surely many of the projects are depending on having ability to trade with the United States and make profit from it, so they can pay back their loans, right?
Yeah. So late in the Clinton administration, so this is around 1999, there was a piece of legislation passed called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and it's called AGOA. And when I came in 2001, I thought it was a gift because it could allow us to start to build better trade relations with African countries. it was a preferential agreement, meaning that it lowered our barriers to certain types of products, textile and apparel and others, and became quite important in the growth of a number of these countries. AGOA is up for renewal. It probably won't get renewed. So the short answer is it won't be good for these economies. They'll try to orient themselves towards elsewhere. I mean, Europe, obviously. China will be quite happy to deal with them, right? So if you're worried about relations with China or Chinese dominance of it, you're kind of handing countries over to sort of Chinese sort of influence. And again, but I don't like to just play the China-US card. To me, it's a question of kind of opportunity for people. And I'll share with you a slightly more positive story, perhaps to close on this. So when I was at the World Bank in 2007, there was a food price crisis right before there was the financial crisis. So many people in developed countries didn't know this, but prices surged, and for a lot of developing countries, they couldn't get seed and fertilizer and food. So I created a special trust fund. I got additional funds from countries and tried to work with countries to help meet sort of immediate needs. And when I left the World Bank 5 years later, the Rwandan agriculture minister told me a story that really made me feel quite positive about development. She said, look, in your first year, you helped us get seeds that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to get and, you know, managed to keep our plantings up. She said, in your third year, we got a loan that do agricultural terracing to improve the infrastructure, which increased the productivity of our agriculture. And then in your fifth year, IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, helped us create a private sector warehouse system because we'd been so productive. So you went over 5 years and you could see the changes that are sort of going forward. Now this is a country, you know, that went through a Holocaust, right? And so there's arguments about whether the leader of Rwanda, Kagame, is too authoritarian and so on and so forth. But there are success stories here. And so, you know, whether, we talked about this with the class, whether you argue it from the point of view of demographics, you know, people, you know, where people either going to come or they're going to have jobs, whether you argue it from economic growth, many people don't know that last year 60% of the growth in the world was from developing countries, about 28% from China, but 45% of the world economy is developing countries. And so, you know, if you want to grow, it helps them to grow. Or if you do it from the point of view of a moral position about helping people survive and have opportunity. So that's one reason I was at the World Bank.
Thank you very much.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thanks again for just a great presentation and discussion, and let's all give it one more round of applause. Thank you.
If I could just say one more word. Look, when John invited me out, I wanted to come for a few reasons, but one of the reasons why, going back to when you asked about support for trade, is that, look, I'm from the Midwest originally, but I've lived much of my life on the East Coast or on an airplane. American foreign policy doesn't succeed unless people across the country support it, okay? And they've got a lot of other interests, okay? So when I have an opportunity to come to different parts of the country that people are interested in discussing sort of international issues and what's going on, I always try to take advantage of it. A, to hear what people are thinking and what's on their mind, but also because the kind of the perspective that you will represent in this community and try to help, and by helping with this institution and with the university, this is critically important, okay? And when I talk to foreign ambassadors in the United States, I always say to them, look, you have to do your business in Washington, but get out, see the country, and you know, whether it's election season or you understand what people are talking about, okay, and what they're thinking about, and whether it's sort of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or whether it's the Middle East, or whether it's trade issues, because in a sense, this is the foundation of American foreign policy. If you read my book, you'll see that in addition to talking about alliances and economics and technology, I have a point about no foreign policy that I've ever been part of succeeds unless you can bring along public support, okay? So all of you in this community, I want to thank you for your support and your interest. And please keep it up, because we're going to be in a bumpy ride here.
If anyone wants an autograph of their book,
Oh, yeah.
Bob will do that. So.
Or should I go to the table?
Sure, that'd be good. Yeah.
Also, please join us on the other half of the ballroom for heavy hors d'oeuvres and drinks. Thank you for coming.